A college student in 2016 is scrolling through dusty cemetery records, doing genealogy research for a completely unrelated project. She stumbles across a bizarre entry. Unknown white female bones. Cause of death? Gunshot wound to the head. Date found? February 1975. And here's where it gets strange. For over 40 years, nobody had claimed her. Nobody had identified her. This Jane Doe had been forgotten by the system. But what this student didn't know was that she was about to crack open a case that would expose one of the most shocking failures in modern law enforcement history. Because somewhere in Akron, Ohio, a family had been searching for their missing daughter for decades. They'd called police. They'd made the connection. They'd even correctly identified the body. But due to a single typing error, their loved one remained buried in an unmarked grave while her killer walked free. This is the story of Linda Pagano, a 17-year-old honor student whose murder was solved not by seasoned detectives or advanced forensics, but by Reddit users and a curious college kid who refused to let a clerical error bury the truth. September 1st, 1974. Labor Day weekend in Akron, Ohio. Linda Pagano comes home late from a concert, her face still glowing with the excitement of live music. She's 17, the baby of the Pagano family, and by all accounts, the golden child. While her older brother Michael was constantly in trouble and sister Cheryl was rebellious, Linda was different. She was the one who worked part-time serving hot dogs after school. The one who saved up for her shiny orange Ford Mustang. The one who actually felt guilty when her siblings paid her to keep quiet about their misbehavior and would end up telling their parents anyway. But tonight, something was different. Her stepfather, Byron Claflin, was waiting, and he was drunk. Again. Byron Claflin worked as a bartender and had a reputation for violent outbursts, especially when he'd been drinking. The argument that followed was explosive. Neighbors would later recall hearing shouting from the Carnegie Avenue apartment. Linda, fed up with the confrontation, grabbed her things and left. She told Claflin she was going to stay with friends. Nobody in the Pagano family would ever see Linda alive again. Here's where our detective instincts should immediately kick in. Linda left behind her prized orange Mustang. Think about that for a moment. What 17-year-old leaves their car behind when running away? This wasn't a planned departure. This was someone fleeing a dangerous situation, expecting to return. The next morning, Byron Claflin made a phone call that would haunt the Pagano family for decades. He called Linda's mother, Cheryl Pagano Sr., asking if Linda had shown up there. When the answer was no, panic set in. The family immediately contacted Akron police and filed a missing person report. But here's where the first critical mistake was made. In 1974, missing teenagers were almost automatically classified as runaways. There was no Amber Alert system, no immediate media coverage, no massive search efforts. Linda's disappearance was treated as just another rebellious teen acting out against authority. The Pagano family wasn't buying it. They knew Linda. This wasn't her character. They printed their own missing person flyers. They searched neighborhoods. They contacted friends. They did everything law enforcement should have been doing, but wasn't. 6 months passed. Winter turned to spring. The family's hope began to fade. Then on February 5, 1975, 3 teenage boys were hiking through what is now called Millstream Run Reservation in Strongsville, Ohio, about 30 miles from Akron. They were following the banks of Rocky River when they made a discovery that would change everything. Partially buried in the muddy riverbank were human remains, but these weren't just any remains. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to prevent identification. The skull was missing its jawbone. Multiple teeth had been deliberately removed using what appeared to be a saw. The arms and legs were completely gone, likely dismembered and disposed of elsewhere. This was the work of someone who understood that dental records and bone structure were key to identification. This was premeditated concealment. The Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office took control of the remains. Initial analysis revealed the victim was a white female, approximately 20 years old, who had died from a gunshot wound to the head. The case was immediately classified as a homicide. News of the discovery spread through local media. And this is where the story takes its most frustrating turn. Michael Pagano, Linda's older brother, was watching television when the news report aired. Something about the description, the timeline, the location, triggered his detective instincts. This could be Linda. Michael immediately called the Strongsville Police Department. He provided Linda's description, her missing person case number, and explained the timeline perfectly matched. The response he received would haunt him for the next 4 decades. A female officer answered his call. After listening to Michael's information, she dismissed him with a single sentence. "Oh no, this victim is too old and probably too tall to be your sister." That was it. Case closed. No follow-up investigation. No comparison of records. No second opinion. A family's plea for answers was dismissed in under 5 minutes. But here's what that officer didn't know, what the entire system failed to recognize. The age estimation was wrong. The height calculation was incorrect. Michael Pagano's instincts were absolutely correct. The Jane Doe found in Strongsville was indeed his missing sister. The unidentified remains were eventually buried in an unmarked grave at Memorial Gardens Cemetery in Highland Hills, Ohio. She was placed in what's called a potter's field, where unclaimed bodies are interred. A teenage murder victim, reduced to a case number, forgotten by the very system meant to protect her. Meanwhile, the Pagano family continued their search. They never stopped believing Linda was out there somewhere. They never accepted that she had simply run away. Michael Pagano later described those years as being an angry young man for 40 years, carrying the weight of unanswered questions and systemic failure. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. The reason this case remained unsolved for so long wasn't due to lack of evidence or witness testimony. It was because of something so mundane, so preventable, that it exposes a terrifying flaw in our justice system. Linda Pagano's missing person case was never entered into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. Not because of complex legal procedures or bureaucratic delays, but because of a simple clerical error. Somewhere in the filing process, someone made a spelling mistake, or misfiled paperwork, or simply forgot to complete the data entry. This means that for over 40 years, while families across the country were searching databases for their missing loved ones, Linda Pagano was invisible. Her case didn't exist in the system designed to solve exactly these types of mysteries. Think about the implications of this. How many other victims are lost in filing cabinets because of similar errors? How many families are still searching for answers that are sitting right there in some bureaucrat's inbox? If you're finding this case as infuriating as it should be, if you're wondering how our system could fail this badly, then make sure you're subscribed, because this story is about to take an even more incredible turn. We're going to explore how internet sleuths and a determined college student succeeded where law enforcement failed for decades. The case might have remained unsolved forever if not for the curiosity of Christina Skates, a Cleveland State University student who was researching her own family genealogy in 2016. Skates was scrolling through cemetery records when she discovered the entry for unknown white female bones at Memorial Gardens Cemetery. Something about this Jane Doe captured Skates' attention. The circumstances were unusual. A young woman, murdered execution style, found in a park, never identified despite modern forensic capabilities. Skates decided to dig deeper. She contacted Cleveland Metroparks Rangers and obtained the original case files. She researched newspaper archives from 1975. She studied the medical examiner reports. What she discovered shocked her. This wasn't just an unsolved murder. This was a victim who had been systematically erased from the system. Skates took her research online, posting about the case in true crime forums and social media groups. She provided detailed information about the Jane Doe, including the circumstances of discovery, the estimated age and physical characteristics, and the timeline. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Amateur detectives and crime enthusiasts began their own investigations. They cross-referenced missing person reports from the era. They analyzed geographical connections. They created detailed timelines and suspect profiles. One of the most significant contributors was a Reddit user going by the handle CallMees. This user had been researching various cold cases and noticed striking similarities between the Strongsville Jane Doe and several missing person cases from the same time period. But the breakthrough came when forensic artist Carl Koppelman became involved. Koppelman specializes in creating facial reconstructions of unidentified remains, using advanced techniques to approximate what victims looked like when alive. Using the skull measurements and bone structure from the Strongsville Jane Doe, Koppelman created a detailed facial reconstruction. The result was haunting. The face that emerged from his computer showed a young woman with gentle features, kind eyes, and an unmistakable resemblance to someone who had been missing since 1974. When the reconstruction was posted online, the response was immediate. Multiple users commented that the face looked remarkably similar to Linda Pagano, whose missing person case had finally been added to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System database. The similarities were undeniable. The age matched. The time frame was perfect. The geographical proximity made sense. But most compelling of all, the facial features were nearly identical to photographs of Linda Pagano from 1974. Akron Police Department cold case detectives were contacted about the potential match. In December 2016, more than 40 years after Linda's disappearance, her case was finally, officially connected to the Strongsville Jane Doe. What followed was a painstaking process of verification. Dental records, though limited due to the deliberate removal of teeth, were compared. DNA samples were requested from Linda's surviving siblings. The bureaucratic wheels that had failed so catastrophically in 1975 finally began to turn. In October 2017, the remains were exhumed from their unmarked grave at Memorial Gardens Cemetery. Due to the number of unmarked graves in the Potter's Field, it took multiple attempts to locate the correct body. The University of Akron assisted with magnetic surveying to map the burial sites. Once the correct remains were recovered, bone samples were taken for DNA analysis. Michael and Cheryl Pagano provided mouth swabs for comparison. The samples were sent to a specialized forensic laboratory for processing. The wait was agonizing. After 4 decades of uncertainty, the Pagano family was finally on the verge of answers. But DNA analysis takes time, especially with degraded samples from remains that had been buried for over 40 years. On July 12, 2018, the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office held a press conference that would finally close one chapter of this tragic story. The DNA results were conclusive. The Jane Doe found in Strongsville in 1975 was definitively identified as Linda Marie Pagano. Michael Pagano's reaction was captured on camera. "I thought I was in a dream," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I thought this day would never come. I figured I'd die wondering." The identification brought closure to a family that had spent 44 years in limbo, but it also opened a new chapter in the investigation. Now that the victim had been positively identified, law enforcement could focus on the most important question: who killed Linda Pagano? The investigation was transferred to Cleveland Metro Parks Police since the remains were found on park property. Lieutenant Don Silvas announced that they would begin by re-interviewing everyone connected to the original case. But here's where our detective analysis becomes crucial. After 4 decades, many of the original suspects and witnesses were dead. Memories had faded. Evidence had been lost. The delay caused by that initial clerical error hadn't just buried a victim's identity, it had severely compromised the chances of ever finding her killer. However, new information has emerged that provides fascinating insights into potential suspects and motives. Based on my analysis of the case files and witness statements, here are the key persons of interest and the theories that have developed around each. Byron Claflin, Linda's stepfather, remains the primary suspect in most investigators' minds. Claflin had a documented history of violence, especially when drinking. He was the last person known to have seen Linda alive. The argument that preceded her disappearance was severe enough that neighbors remembered it decades later. But here's what makes Claflin particularly suspicious from a detective's perspective. His behavior immediately after Linda's disappearance was inconsistent with innocence. Instead of immediately contacting police when Linda didn't return, he waited until the next morning to call her family. When he did make contact, he seemed more concerned with establishing an alibi than finding Linda. Crime scene analysis suggests Linda's killer had knowledge of forensic identification methods. The deliberate removal of teeth and the jawbone indicates someone who understood that dental records were primary identification tools. The dismemberment and disposal of limbs shows planning and an attempt to prevent discovery. Claflin, as a bartender, would have had access to tools capable of dismemberment. He would have known the local area well enough to select an isolated disposal site. Most importantly, he had the strongest motive. Linda represented a threat to his control over the household, and her potential testimony about domestic violence could have had serious legal consequences. The second person of interest is Steve Wilson, Linda's boyfriend at the time of her disappearance. Wilson has received less attention in media coverage, but online crime communities have developed intriguing theories about his potential involvement. According to these theories, Wilson may have been involved in drug-related activities that Linda discovered or threatened to expose. The execution-style gunshot wound suggests a more professional killing than a domestic violence incident. However, Wilson's potential involvement raises questions about the level of planning involved in the body disposal. Would a teenage boyfriend have the knowledge and resources necessary for such elaborate concealment efforts? If you've been following this analysis and finding yourself drawn into the investigative process, then you need to hit that subscribe button right now. True crime cases like this require dedicated communities of amateur detectives and crime enthusiasts to keep pressure on law enforcement and ensure justice isn't forgotten. Your engagement helps keep these cases in the public eye where they belong. The most disturbing theory to emerge from online crime communities suggests the possibility of multiple perpetrators. This theory proposes that Linda's murder was not a spontaneous act of violence, but a planned execution carried out by several individuals working together. Supporting evidence for this theory includes the sophistication of the body disposal, the knowledge of forensic countermeasures, and the successful concealment of the crime for over 4 decades. A single perpetrator, especially one acting in anger or passion, would be less likely to execute such a methodical cover-up. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this case isn't the murder itself, but what happened afterward. The system that was supposed to protect Linda, to seek justice for her death, failed at every conceivable level. The initial investigation treated her as a runaway, despite clear evidence to the contrary. When her family made the correct connection to the Jane Doe, they were dismissed without proper investigation. The clerical error that kept her case out of national databases wasn't discovered or corrected for over 40 years. This raises fundamental questions about how many other victims are lost in similar bureaucratic failures. How many families are still searching for loved ones whose cases are sitting in some forgotten filing cabinet? How many killers have escaped justice because of preventable administrative errors? The Linda Pagano case exposes critical flaws in our missing person and cold case investigation systems. It demonstrates the vital role that citizen investigators and online communities play in modern criminal justice. Most importantly, it proves that no case is ever truly cold as long as someone is willing to keep asking questions. Today, Linda's murder remains officially unsolved. Both primary suspects, Byron Claflin and Steve Wilson, are deceased. The physical evidence from 1975 is minimal and degraded. After decades of delay, the chances of a successful prosecution are minimal. But Linda Pagano's story isn't really about solving a murder. It's about the power of persistence, the importance of community involvement in justice, and the critical need for systematic reform in how we handle missing person cases. Christina Skates, the college student whose curiosity started this investigation, didn't set out to solve a murder. She was just researching cemetery records for her own family history, but her refusal to let a Jane Doe remain nameless changed everything for the Pagano family. Michael Pagano, who spent 40 years wondering what happened to his sister, finally got the answers he needed. Not from law enforcement, not from official investigations, but from strangers on the internet who cared enough to keep digging. The Reddit community that helped identify Linda proves that amateur detectives can succeed where professional investigators fail. Their collaborative approach, attention to detail, and refusal to accept bureaucratic dismissals solved a case that had stumped authorities for decades. If this case has taught us anything, it's that justice depends on all of us remaining vigilant, asking questions, and refusing to let victims be forgotten. Every Jane Doe deserves a name. Every family deserves answers. Every killer should face consequences, regardless of how much time has passed. Linda Pagano finally has her name back. She's no longer an unknown set of bones in an unmarked grave. She's remembered as the 17-year-old honor student with the orange Mustang and the bright future that was stolen from her. But her killer is still out there, and that's something none of us should accept. If you're as committed to seeing justice served as I am, make sure you're subscribed and sharing these stories. Because the only thing stronger than a criminal trying to hide their crimes is a community of people determined to expose the truth. The case of Linda Pagano proves that no matter how long it takes, no matter how many systems fail, the truth has a way of surfacing. Sometimes it just takes the right person asking the right questions at the right time. Justice may be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied, not if we keep fighting for it.